Welcome to this special bonus episode of the Passivhaus podcast. I'm Zach Semke, Director of Passivhaus Accelerator, and we're pleased to be sharing a series of bonus episodes recorded at the International Passivhaus Conference 2023 in Wiesbaden, Germany. These interviews were made possible by support from Icon Windows and Doors, Inotech Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, Minitaire, and Proclima. Please enjoy this bonus episode.
My name's Sarah Liz. I'm Research and Policy Director at the UK Passivhaus Trust, and I was on the Scientific Advisory Board for the conference in Wiesbaden, which allowed me to kind of look at all the abstracts which were submitted and part of this kind of selection process, and that is why I was chairing one of the sessions.
That's a tough job, isn't it?
It was quite tough.
Yeah.
Not tough because there was a lot to do, but tough because the quality of the submissions was very high, and they all sound so great, and you want to have everybody.
Yeah.
And it was really hard because it's like we had a percentage that we were allowed to accept, and it was
Right.
like, oh no, I'm accepting them all. I have to cut back, and that's when you can move some to poster presentations. And then the other thing was that some presentations actually get recommended for resubmission because a lot of them were maybe like wanting to present monitoring, but they actually hadn't finished building them. So it was like, maybe that's for 2024.
For next year, yeah.
So it's a bit of that.
It's a great problem to have.
Yes,
Too many
absolutely.
high-quality submissions.
Yeah.
And just before we talk about your session, you mentioned research.
Yes.
And
Research and policy. Yes.
So what does that involve? What's that involved?
Okay, so I suppose I could probably expand. That's my official title, but I actually do research, policy, and education. So in terms of the research side, that is kind of we have a technical panel once a year when all our kind of patron members and people who are significant kind of contributors to the trust, maybe technically or otherwise, or leading in the field, come together and kind of set an agenda for the trust going forward each year. Yeah. So they kind of determine like things that they feel like the industry in the UK could do with for kind of support from a technical side. And then we take that forward, or I take that forward as a project or a series of projects for the year. And then we kind of develop those projects up, and then we report back and work with our technical steering group, which is a kind of voluntary group, which is chaired by Nick Grant, who is another one of the UK people who's here at the conference.
Yeah,
and there's quite a lot of other people actually at the conference who are in that technical steering group, and they kind of comment back on anything that we're producing at the trust, and actually quite often they help with contributing because they are kind of experts in the field to that kind of research work. So that's one thing that we do. And then on the policy side, that's like kind of like lobbying or certainly engaging in policy that's happening, and that's all around the UK. So we're kind of covering England, and we're covering Wales, we're covering Northern Ireland, and we're covering Scotland. Yeah. So and because we don't have one building code that covers all of those areas, all of those nations, it means that we're often engaging with lots of like different people. So Scotland, as an example at the moment, has been making some really remarkable leaps on their Passivhaus journey. So we've had some really
exciting stuff.
There. Yeah.
Potentially. So is that up for discussion now?
You can. Yeah, I can't give you that probably that much information.
No, well, but what's been public has been that they're considering effectively Passivhaus standard.
Exactly. So what happened was that in December last year, we had been working with one of the MSPs, which were the people that work in Parliament, on a private member's bill. So an individual MSP can bring forward a bill to be debated by Parliament to see whether or not they should take it forward. So we'd been helping out someone who was a Labour MSP, who are not the party that are in power, but he brought forward this bill to be considered by the government. Yeah. The government in Scotland at the moment is a coalition government with the SNP and the Green Party. Yeah. So, and they are, from what I can see, they seem to be very supportive of environmental causes. Obviously, the coalition with the Green Party means that that's kind of really embedded. Yeah. So anyway, went to Parliament and it got wide cross-party support. So I watched it with my two little girls sitting on my knee because it was live streamed, obviously. So we were watching
exciting stuff, watching Parliament.
It's super exciting. They're like 5 and 7. But it was kind of groundbreaking because I think they said Passivhaus like 10 times, and that's never happened in Scottish Parliament before or any UK Parliament.
And is it actually Passivhaus? Are they calling it Passivhaus?
They're calling it Passivhaus. So what they said, that they would not take the bill forward. Instead, what they were going to do is introduce secondary legislation to implement Passivhaus or Scottish equivalent.
Right.
So what we at the Passivhaus Trust are doing now is engaging with the politicians still, but also now engaging with building standards who set the code to establish, and obviously the Passivhaus Institute, to try to establish what Passivhaus or Scottish equivalent could look like.
Yeah. Because that'd be a world first, wouldn't it?
It would be a world first if they adopted the standard in its entirety.
Yeah.
And all the mechanisms around the delivery of that is kind of the bit that needs to be, certainly from our point of view, that's the bit we feel like needs to be worked on over the coming months to make sure that we have a really robust way to deliver so that we know that the performance that the government and the politicians want to get out the other end is going to happen. Yeah. And it's kind of separately to that then is the discussions with building standards to see how far they're kind of willing to come. Yeah, so whether, because a big part of Passivhaus is obviously the PHPP, Passivhaus Planning Package. And that is that's giving us like the ultimate energy. It's the energy use intensity, effectively, of a building. It's saying that's the maximum amount of energy that the building can use. Whereas the calculations that we use at the moment that's not how we calculate them. In the code. Yeah, we have a kind of complicated system of you create effectively a model of the building that you're going to build or design, and it applies a certain number of like metrics to that form. Yeah. And then you have to do a percentage improvement on that. So what you're not driving is comparative model. Exactly. Yeah. So you're not driving efficiency of form, you're not driving, efficiency of floor area. Yeah. You're not driving efficiency of fenestration, orientate, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So it's quite a big shift to take it from that notional building model, the comparative notional, to an absolute energy standard.
So a whole change in methodology, not just a change in performance metrics.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're really keen that they don't just take the Passivhaus metrics and bolt it onto the notional comparative building model, because we don't think that will drive the end performance. We're really keen that they adopt the methodology. Yeah. So we're almost more keen that the methodology comes in than the exact numbers.
Right.
Because I think that's where you get the performance is from building in the
That's a whole a whole tangent.
It's not what we're meant to be talking about.
No, but it's fascinating stuff, and that's a really interesting topic. It does kind of relate though to the wide scale application of higher standards in Passivhaus, which is relevant to social housing and larger housing, which is kind of what you were hosting today. Yes. Interesting. So the session was called social housing and
student residence.
So that's kind of lumped in there. But I guess there's some good overlap in that because you've got a large number of people in a space that they're renting or occupying for a period of time. Yes. But large numbers of people in relatively small spaces, I guess, would be a common
absolutely.
Thread. And constrained budgets usually, I would imagine, for those.
I would imagine. I suppose I can't say whether that's necessarily true across the board. I mean, one of the amazing things about the session actually was it was incredibly international. So we had presentations from Manchester, Canada. There was another Canadian one. China. So it's like it was really a kind of diverse collection of different building areas, different building codes, different climates, different continents, and it's so it's hard to know, I guess, like the background policy that sits behind like the delivery of social housing, for example. Yeah. Because I mean, sometimes personally, I don't know whether I can say this like as an absolute thing, but it feels like often the provision of social housing actually is delivered to a higher quality than the private market sale housing. Yeah. Because private market sale is kind of done for a profit to be sold and they don't necessarily mind what the energy use or the ongoing maintenance is for that building because it's not an asset that's retained by the people who are selling it. Whereas social housing is very much retained by the client that commissions the project, so they have a vested interest in the ongoing maintenance and energy performance of that asset going forward. So it feels like I don't know how the budgets compare, but I wouldn't actually think that social housing necessarily has like a more constrained budget than mass scale private residential, if you know what I mean.
When you say quality in that context, you're talking about quality of the envelope.
Yes.
Yeah, as opposed, because a high-end house might have what they can perceive as high-quality kitchens.
Yes, yes,
or high-quality
taps
in their bathroom.
Yeah.
But not necessarily the best windows.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I would say if it's like high-end residential, like client, private client housing, then they get to set the full agenda. So you'd hope that they would also want the high fabric, and they're paying for that, so then they can get that. Yeah. Of course, whether people decide to go for the kitchen rather than the windows is...
So would that be a common theme from the sessions that you facilitated, that certainly the quality envelope and that focus on getting that part right?
Yeah, absolutely. It felt like all the sessions were really, all of the project teams were being driven by this desire to have a really high-performing building envelope at the end, to have lower energy consumption, but also a few of the talks started to touch on that issue around grid capacity. And when you're working on these buildings at such a scale, like you do start to have to answer these questions of, if we're electrifying everything, how are we going to manage to plug into the grid, which is going to be very overstretched as we decarbonize all our buildings. And when you're working on these big projects, you kind of have a responsibility to consider that issue. Yeah. As you kind of
I think I caught a part of that discussion about, because there is this big push to electrify. Yeah. And if that happens quickly, then, it puts stress on things. Yeah. But I think in that demonstration, I'm not exactly sure, I can't remember now who it was, but they showed a very good comparison of lots of sort of code houses, and the energy use very much follows the climate, the seasonal change. But in the passive house, it's much less of a burden, so you get much lower peaks. Yes. So that's a good pathway for electrification.
Absolutely, I think
through passive house.
What do they call that? Demand response. Like the idea that in a passive house building, you can actually, you've got a lower heat input required when you're inputting it, but also you can input it at any time throughout the day. Yeah. Whereas a traditional house, you have to input the energy right before people get up in the morning, and you have to input it before they come home from work. So everybody's pushing that energy at the same time. Whereas in passive house, you could say, we'll just program it to come when the grid's not under stress, without any change to comfort. So
because you got that bigger, it's not really a thermal flywheel, but it's more just that the building's going to retain that heat much better. Yeah. Something I'm interested in, coming back to the economics, because social housing is usually in some instances provided by the government or state housing. Can be quite hard to get that across the line from a taxpayer point of view, or whoever's funding it. Did that come up at all, about funding of social housing to a very high performance standard?
No, nobody really got into funding actually when we were talking about it. Yeah, I don't feel like any of the sessions really drove down on the funding side.
We prefer talking about technical.
It was definitely more about, I feel like a lot of the crux of the discussion came down to the fact that all these projects were doing a lot of post-occupancy monitoring. Yep. And it was like, these were some of the first of the scale and typology that were being delivered in each of these countries. And it was like trying to learn from the post-occupancy evaluation how the specific end users in that country were using the buildings, and how the buildings were sitting in that country and how they were working, and whether the PHP certification calculations were representative for that particular area, for the particular user group. And I felt like a lot of the discussion came back to that.
And in some places they weren't.
I think across the board, we all kind of know that the PHP is what it's really good at, is kind of working out what the average is going to be, whether you're always going to have high users and low users. Yeah. And it feels like on space heat demand, that seems to be relatively consistent. You can always go into PHP and adjust the internal temperature, and you could then re-look at the calculation. The big difference seemed to be in the hot water use, which we kind of know, because we know that like in the UK, the way we shower is to leave the water running the whole time. Yeah. So we use a lot more water than They allow for it in Germany. Whereas I understand it, they would turn the water off during the shower when they're showering. Or maybe they just have shorter showers, but they have a lot lower domestic hot water demands, and North America seems to fall in much more like the UK with the higher demand.
Yeah.
So that was an area where there was a discrepancy, and it's literally to do with the hot water use. Now in PHPP, there's just a cell that you can go in and you can tell them how many litres of hot water per person you expect in the building, and then it adjusts the calculation. But for certification, people have, you don't have to go to that level of,
Yeah,
so the question was, maybe when you're advising clients, though, you're advising them, of course, on the actual energy use of the building. So what people were saying is, yes, you were using the calculation and then making sure that it was representative for the clients, but it might not be exactly the same as what's used for certification. So it was the hot water one. And in China, they were finding that overall the energy demand was higher, and that came down to one thing Feihan was saying was that he thought a lot of it came back to the much higher cooking load. I don't know if it's cooking loads, but much higher use of cooking. So they're cooking for breakfast, lunch and dinner.
Oh, I
so
see.
they cook for all their meals.
Right.
So because of that, and there's often a lot of oils being cooked, so that the extract systems are losing more heat to the outside because they're working harder for more of the day.
Yep.
And then he was saying that also people would smoke in their houses.
Right.
And when they're smoking in their houses, they're opening their windows because obviously otherwise the smells are in the house. Of course, the ventilation system would be moving some, but I don't know how much, having not been in a house with a smoker, how much it actually does take out, and how much of that's just habit. They're smoking, so they open the window. So again, it's just that comes down to understanding the end users. And I think one of the powerful things about a tool like PHPP is it's completely transparent. So you can see all the calculations. So it's very simple to go in and make any adjustments for your location or your end users. But it would be up to a kind of informed design team. And I think these presentations that we have are so useful because people are starting to tease out for their location and their end users where any differences are from the standard model in the PHP, and also that highlights where potentially focus can be put to lower those demands. So if we know that hot water is a higher use in the UK, maybe hot water heat recovery systems or something we should be thinking about more. Because it's more important for us because it's more of our demand.
And I've heard those mentioned a couple of times today, and different types of one. There was a discussion about active versus passive. Heat water recovery or from showers. I guess the underlying thing there, and there were some great slides on the topic of the unpredictability of the human factor, that we can model these buildings and generally all those fixed things to do with the envelope. PHP predicts those very, very well. But when you stick people in, that's when things go weird. And I think probably more so in social housing, this has been our experience with our social housing provider in New Zealand, is they expect the occupancy rates to be higher than normal. They may not be, but they could be up to double what a normal household would be. And that's pretty hard to design for. And then the added complication is not knowing when those people are going to turn things off that should not be turned off.
So before I was at the trust, I was working as an architect, as a Passivhaus architect. And when we worked on social housing projects, the kind of approach we took was for certification, keep the occupancy low, as in use the PHPP default for certification, because you don't want to assume there's going to be loads of people and then there's not loads of people and the building's cold. So for the heating side, we're like, we should do that. But then for the internal heat gain side, we add all the people in and make it a worst case scenario. So we run a big difference in internal heat gains from the winter to the summer. So in the summer, we're like, okay, we'll put all the people in and we'll assume there's lots of people so that we know that we're not getting a summer overheating issue from all the extra internal gains. So that was one of the things we were looking at.
Would that dictate your ventilation as well, and the capacity?
We would always, in the way that it works in the UK anyway, is that our the part of the regulations that sets ventilation rates actually sets them higher than you need for passive house.
Oh, really?
I think it largely comes, again, this is a personal thought, but I think from speaking with people, I think it largely comes down to the fact that it's based on a kind of natural ventilation system. So, natural ventilation never really delivers as much as you might expect because people are not opening their windows in winters and they're taping over their trickle vents on their windows because they don't like the drafts, and they're not maintaining the trickle vents because people don't think they need maintenance.
You're clogged up.
So it forces you to have a higher exchange rate in design because it's never delivered in practice. Whereas with MVHR, you kind of get what you design.
Yeah.
So the way that we tend to do it is that the standard rate on the MVHR system is the passive house rate, and then the boost goes to like the higher, like level 3.
Yeah.
If it's like 1, 2, 3, 2's the certification. In the middle, 1's you're on holiday or whatever. And 3's, if you had a higher occupancy, you could run it at 3.
Yeah.
That's the kind of, and that meets the building compliance. So if you had a higher occupancy, you could just have it set to the higher ventilation.
But that works well on a individual household basis where the client's really engaged in the turning the dial up when they have a party or down when they go away. If you're a social, you got a public house and you're a tenant in there, you're probably not going to either know that even exists or be knowledgeable about how to use it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I feel like I would have to defer to someone who's worked recently on one of those projects to find out the approach they take. Whether it's just that all the units are set to the higher level, and Well, I'm pretty sure someone spoke about maintenance schedules and the fact that a lot of buildings have what they would call superintendents or in the US or building supervisors. And I did see a slide in that session that said that in general, the experience has been that stuff like the program maintenance, changing the filters and that sort of thing is all good. Yeah.
What is tricky is stopping people from turning off fans or from not doing the sort of day-to-day things.
Yeah, that's certainly something we'd heard about in early projects in the UK. I don't think anyone went into enough detail here to really tease out an answer to the question, but I think that what did come out was that various people were saying that more needs to be done on the post-occupancy evaluation. So it was really good to see that people were talking about that. Yeah. But the discussion about like Lewis and Mark, so they were talking about fully occupied multi-family passive house homes, and one of the things they were saying was that occupant education is something that's come out of the post-occupancy evaluation is something that needs to be better. Yeah. Yeah. And if we hadn't had loads of questions, because I always like to note down questions in case there's none in the room, but then there was lots of questions in the room. Everybody was very engaged. So I didn't get to ask any of my questions, but one of my questions would have been, what would that look like? Like, how do we do a better job of educating?
Was it them that said they had offered a workshop, but no one turned up?
That was, yes. I think that was them. I think that was Lois who said that.
Yeah, because that's the obvious is, we'll just have a workshop and everyone will come and learn about how to operate their house. But that's us who are really interested in things like that. It's a bit like...
Well, I mean, when I worked on a social housing project in Norwich, we were like, we'll do a bird box building in the garden for like all the families to come to. And then when they're there, we'll be like, so this is how you do this. So kind of try to make it more stealth. Teasing. Exactly. I feel like, this will be a really fun day, but also, do you know how to use your ventilation system?
Yeah, that's got it.
And another thing we took to doing was we would create very picture-based posters, and then they got laminated and bolted onto the inside of the door where the MVHR unit was. Right. It was just very graphic, and it was like, this is an amazing thing for your health and well-being. Yeah. Don't turn it off.
Don't turn it off. Yeah.
If you're worried about it, like, call this number. Like, don't fiddle around and turn it off, and But I guess it's always going to be an issue, especially when we're living through this like fuel crisis where people can't afford their energy. People are going to turn off anything in the house that they think.
Yeah, and they're worried about this big box that's humming very quietly, but is like they don't know how important it is.
Yeah.
And I think someone else mentioned about, I don't know if it was in that session or another one, about the technology. Not, I think it might have been Lois again talking about alarm systems and it taking take a while for notifications if a system does fail, like a large ventilation system, like if it's lights or something like that, it's obvious straight away. But a ventilation system, it might take a little while to actually notice that something's happening. So having better controls and alarms and someone to respond to those alarms would be pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rounding out the session, there was a story about air tightness testing.
Yes,
which so this is not about usability, but about the complexity of pressure testing, because some of these buildings are quite big.
Yes.
So I guess first of all the decision has to be made as to if they're doing a whole building or individual room or apartment.
It's staged. Compartment, like to how they're going to compartmentalize the testing process during construction, and then also at the end, I guess. So there's a question about is it a whole building model, or are there multiple buildings which are literally going to be kept separate and modeled separately? All those questions have to.
And when some of these buildings would have shared spaces as well, wouldn't they? So they have communal spaces that may or may not be part of the condition space of the building envelope. So that can be quite hard just figuring out what you're actually going to test and then the complexity of doing the test.
Sure. I mean, I think that the contractors are going to always be working with, and the design teams actually are going to be working with pretty experienced air testers on doing that air testing of these kind of buildings.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of knowledge out there with these very specialist air testers who can help to put together the strategy. So they quite often, at least in the UK, what we see is the air tester comes on and as an advisor as well to help to advise on the strategy for the building and program out the testing process so that that's all in place and everybody is very clear on that before you get to, even before you get to the full design, because you actually need to know how that's going. You need to have a plan in your head how that's going to work before you can actually progress through the detailed design. Yeah, you
can't just show up with your blower door.
Exactly. I mean, we say that those people are really valuable at that critical strategic design phase.
Right.
But then also at when you're doing those blower door tests, that it's not just like, oh, the blower door guys here, we'll all go for a cup of tea. It's like, amazing, we've got a specialist on site that's going to help us identify where we can improve our building. And their job is, your job, if you're on site, is to walk around with the pressure tester, with the tools, with the thermography cameras, with the smoke pens, and try to identify where improvements can be made. That it's a diagnostic thing, and everybody should see it as like a really positive tool rather than like a kind of stick. You just need to hit this number and compliance.
So it's that incremental testing during the build stage rather than just the final test at the end.
I mean, I thought the mock building pod that he introduced as step one, where they built this mini pod and they put as many of the different junctions and components in, and they air pressure tested it and like refined things, that we've had the same setup used in the UK, where people have built miniature versions of buildings just to kind of stress test certain like products or components, and then it becomes like a teaching tool. So as trades come on site, they can go and see the pod.
That is a great idea. I mean, I've seen that done for individual elements. So how to do a window install, and an architect or an engineer coming and checking that's up to their standard, but doing it in that pod and allowing you to actually pressure test it. It's a great idea. Because then, I mean, because on these buildings they're going to do that installation up possibly hundreds of times if they're doing that same detail over and over again. So it totally makes sense to
I think it's like it's so visual, isn't it?
Well, then everyone walks past that when they come on site every day, and or they can nip down and check it. And,
awesome. I think it's very valuable.
So, what are the main takeaways you think from that session on social housing?
So I think we've got to acknowledge the importance and the really good work actually that everybody was doing in gathering that post-occupancy evaluation, doing the building performance evaluation work so that we can actually learn from these first buildings, take it forward, report it, share the findings, make sure that everybody knows the good lessons as well as the bits that went wrong that we can improve next time. So I think for me, it's just like, yes, more data, always more data.
Yeah. I want to acknowledge as well how exciting and how important it is to even have social housing being built to Passivhaus standard, because it breaks the mould of Passivhaus being seen as high end and only applicable to quite architecturally designed one-off houses in really cold climates. But to have it being applied to a completely different, but arguably the most needy.
I was just about to say
context.
That it's literally the best. It's the best place for us to put our energy as Passivhaus designers and Passivhaus proponents to be like, these are the clients we need to be building these buildings. These are the end users that we want to get into these buildings. They're the most vulnerable people in our society. We need to have homes which are comfortable and safe. We've had some awful stories in the press in the UK in the last year about there was a child who died because they were in a mouldy house. And it was just like, it's so heartbreaking to think that our buildings are in such a state that can happen. So the idea that we could just be building these buildings which are so robust and they're going to be so warm. And in fact, Kate de Salencourt is going to be doing a presentation in the plenary session tomorrow, or one of the group sessions, one of the plenaries tomorrow, kind of on that topic of like how safe is it, like when you can't afford your heating anymore? What happens when you turn off your heat in a normal house? What happens when you turn off your heat in a passive house? And the safety that is provided by these buildings is something that means that I just think it's so applicable as a standard for social housing that it feels like Scotland is looking at doing it for all housing, but I think that when you look at it, we should do it for social housing everywhere.
Totally agree. And I also think that safety is worryingly happening in the hot seasons now as well.
Yes.
We're certainly seeing that in warmer climates, but it's pretty scary when houses are equally bad at looking after people in the middle of a heat wave than they are in the middle of a cold snap.
I mean, the UK, we did hit 40 degrees this summer, and our buildings are very much not designed for that because we don't have any cooling systems, and we don't operate external shades, and it was a genuine issue. So I think that understanding the importance for the summer condition is equally important, even in somewhere like the UK where it's not that warm.
Even
because we're having that change, weather change.
Hey, well, thank you. Well done. I know it's a hard job facilitating a session with so much great content, but you did a good job.